let us direct our attention to the national anthem of Indonesia, Indonesia Raya, followed by the university hymn. Let us direct our attention to the national anthem of Indonesia, Indonesia Raya, followed by the university hymn. Let us direct our attention to the national anthem of Indonesia, Indonesia Raya, followed by the university hymn. Let us On the 21st of September 2021, the Indonesian International Islamic University has commenced its academic year through its first academic convocation. During the course of our campus lectures, it is our pleasure to continue presenting a series of international webinars, all of which will appease you with captivating topics and introduce you with several brilliant speakers of international repute. Our utmost respect for all of the speakers in our previous webinars, where we had Professor Ahmed Tikuru, Professor Abdullahi Ahmed An-Naim, Professor Tim Lindsay, Professor Muhammad Azmi Omar, Professor Muhammad Rugi, and Professor Abdullah Sahin, some of which are now adjunct professors at UIII, and all phenomenal in their expertise and respective approaches. Today, please welcome Professor Robert Hefner from Boston University as our guest speaker, presenting the topic of why the study of Islam in Indonesia is important for Islamic studies and comparative democratic theory. Professor Robert Hefner, from 2016 to 2019, was director of the Religion and Education Committee in the United States Indonesia Society as part of the presidential initiative undertaken by Presidents Barack Obama and Joko Widodo on religious pluralism in Indonesia and the United States. For an in-depth discussion regarding the topic, all participants may use the Q&A feature on Zoom to ask questions after the presentation. All blessed panelists and attendees, UIIU is a newly established legal entity state international university founded in 2016 upon the presidential regulation of Indonesia and operates under the administration of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. For a brief introduction about the university, I would like to invite you all to watch our UIIU profile video.
Tuhan tidak akan mengubah nasib suatu bangsa, sampai bangsa itu mengubah diri mereka sendiri. Sebuah pepatah kuno mengatakan, saat angin perubahan bertiup, sebagian orang membangun tembok, sebagian lainnya membangun kincir angin. Di Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia, kita membangun tembok dan kincir angin sekaligus. Kita membangun fasilitas pendidikan yang kokoh, namun juga siap mengawal perubahan. Umat Islam Indonesia besar jumlahnya, tapi pengaruhnya dalam menyuarakan isu-isu global belum begitu besar. Sebagai negara dengan jumlah penduduk muslim terbesar di dunia, sudah sewajarnya, serta sepantasnya Indonesia menjadi rujukan kemajuan peradaban Islam dunia. Namun, untuk menuju ke arah sana, perlu upaya yang serius dan nyata, serta dukungan sumber daya manusia yang unggul. Pada 5 Juni 2018, Presiden Joko Widodo melaksanakan peletakan batu pertama pembangunan kampus UIII bertaraf internasional, agar menjadi kampus terkemuka dan prestisius. Hingga September 2021, pembangunan fisik masih terus berlangsung dan mengalami banyak kemajuan. UIII juga telah menyiapkan sistem akademik, manajemen, tata kelola, dosen, mahasiswa, serta program beasiswa. Untuk tahun akademik 2021-2022 ini, UIII telah membuka 4 program studi magister, yaitu Magister Studi Islam, Magister Ilmu Politik, Magister Ilmu Ekonomi, dan Magister Ilmu Pendidikan. Pada awal Juni 2021 lalu, UIII telah membuka pendaftaran calon mahasiswa baru melalui program UIII Scholarship. Dalam waktu 40 hari, pelamar program tersebut mencapai lebih dari 1.000 orang dari 59 negara. Melalui seleksi 3 tahap yang ketat, 100 orang mahasiswa dalam dan luar negeri terpilih menjadi penerima beasiswa UIII. Perkuliahan pertama di kampus UIII akan dimulai 27 September 2021. Semenjak awal didirikan, UIII bertekad mendukung kemajuan pendidikan dunia, menciptakan kesejahteraan umat manusia, sekaligus mempromosikan Indonesia ke dunia luar. Dengan membantu anak-anak muda potensial dari dalam dan luar negeri, memfasilitasi mereka untuk membuka diri, serta mengantarkan mereka berjalan menuju masa depan yang cerah, dan diharapkan menjadi tokoh dan pemimpin bangsa di kemudian hari. Dengan mengambil peran lebih aktif, diharapkan Indonesia akan lebih dikenal dunia, di mana kampus UIII akan menjadi pusat kajian dan implementasi peradaban Islam wasatiyah atau Islam yang rahmatan lil alamin, terbuka dan toleran demi masa depan Indonesia dan dunia yang lebih baik.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoy the brief visual about our new campus. Now, let us begin this webinar by inviting Professor Komarudin Hidayat to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you, Fahrul. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Well, depending on where you are, first of all, I would like to say a very good morning for those of you who are attending this webinar from Indonesia, and a very good evening if you are participating from the US, like Professor Robert Hefner from Boston University. Thank you, Prof. Robert, for being generous to share your deep knowledge and wisdom about Islam and democracy in Indonesia. This is a routine discussion series that we are trying to establish here at the UIII. As all of you might know, it is a university that focuses on graduate training, concentrating on master and PhD level education. This webinar series is one of our efforts to stimulate intellectual exchange between our student and academic staff with international scholars and the public in general. As the name suggests, the UIII is doing teaching and research on issues related to the Muslim world and how the Muslim world engage with the rest. Indonesia, of course, is a relevant country. Indonesia is not Islamic state, but it is a country not based on any religion, given the diversity of its religious life as well as ethnic grouping. It is some people say that Indonesia is the largest Muslim country, but it is not Islamic state. One should also remember that Indonesia, given its huge population and economic size, is a middle power that might be an important player in today's international relations. The World Bank and IMF, for example, both have predicted that by 2024, Indonesia will be the world's fifth largest economy after China, the US, Japan, and India. Nevertheless, being a Muslim majority country, approximately 85% of Indonesia's 250 million population are Muslims. Islam is one way or another will certainly shape the social, economic, and political dynamic in the archipelago. After the fall of the New Order government in 1998, some observers believe that Indonesia would face similar fate as the former Yugoslavia that was broken apart into smaller states. Following the collapse of Suharto's regime that had ruled the country for 32 years struggle for power, secessionist movement in Papua, Aceh, and East Timor suffer financial and economic crisis. Various bloody internal conflict between Muslim and Christians surrounding the 1998 period in the Maluku and Poso region, as well as devastating ethnic conflict in Kalimantan issue. Yet, various democratic mechanisms that were installed in 1998 with all the shortcomings now seem to work. Multi-party system in which Islamic and non-Islamic parties are allowed to compete, regular direct presidential and legislative elections, transfer of power from the central to local government have been institutionalized. Therefore, it is not exaggeration to say that Indonesia is now the largest Muslim electoral democracy. Against all odds, Indonesia has defeated doubt about the compatibility between Islam and democracy. However, it must be noted that recently there have been concern about the growing intolerance and extremism that needs to be dealt with either by government or by civil society as one important ingredient in democracy and plural society. It indicates that one important question, which is the relationship between the state and religion, still remains. To understand the phenomena of Indonesia as the largest Muslim electoral democracy and how Islam and the state are interacting in the country, none other than Professor Robert Hefner can enlighten us. Professor Hefner's work on Islam in Indonesia have been widely read. So once again, I would like to thank Prof. Hefner for agreeing to do this, for your generosity to share your wisdom and knowledge about Indonesia. And I hope that this webinar can illuminate what lesson can be drawn from Indonesia's experience in which Islam and democracy are not mutually exclusive. The last word I would like to say that thank for your willingness to be part of our university, Prof. We are looking forward for you visiting to Indonesia. And I do hope that this seminar will be productive and enriching our horizon about Islam and democracy, particularly in Indonesia. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor, for your speech. We can now continue to the webinar session. I would like to invite Mr. Phillips J. Vermonte, PhD, the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, to chair this session.
Thank you, Farul. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning to everyone. I'm honored to chair this session and webinar with a very important question on why the study of Islam in Indonesia is important for Islamic studies, as well as for comparative democratic theory. And we are honored to have Professor Hefner. Hi, Professor Hefner. Very good evening there. To share his views and thoughts on the questions, as we understood that the topic is actually part of his newest draft of books. And we are glad that Professor Hefner is agreeing to do this. And hopefully, as Professor Hefner will enlighten us on the issue, hopefully from the participants, we would also get feedbacks and probably insights that Professor Hefner would want to incorporate in his book later on. And then also the public would get insights and benefits from this discussion. Now, for those of you participating, you can use the Q&A facilities on your Zoom screen at the bottom. So post your question there, and I will try to pick it up later on. And hopefully Professor Hefner and also probably others in the panel would want to comment and respond as well. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Hefner to share his thoughts. I hope that 15 to 20 minutes would be enough. If not, of course, I will be very gladly to extend your time, because probably 15 to 20 minutes would not be enough as well. Professor Hefner, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Pat Vermonte. A quick question. I was actually told I should speak for 45 minutes to an hour.
Sure. All right.
Okay. I would have been happy to speak, and why don't I just give my presentation and you can cut me at whatever point. But I think I may have misunderstood the time length. But let me begin by saying simply thank you, Pat Vermonte. And I went to in this midst of this dark season of COVID pandemics. Let me say that it's a great honor and pleasure for me to join you for this IIIU webinar. Let me begin also, however, by expressing my warm thanks to three dear friends. First, Rector Professor Kamarudin Hidayat, and then, of course, a dear friend, equally dear friend, Professor Haidar Bahmualim, and Pak Jamhari Makhruf, three people with whom I have had a long acquaintance and enormous respect, and most importantly, three people from whom I have learned a good deal about Indonesia and about Islam. With COVID, I've not had an opportunity to congratulate Pak Komar and the entire UIIU faculty on the official inauguration of the UIIU. So let me take this opportunity this morning to extend my warm congratulations to all of you. As my remarks today will make clear, I am, among other things, an observer of Islamic higher education around the world, not just in Indonesia. In fact, after my years of research in Indonesia, made the study of Islamic education in other Muslim majority countries a primary focus. And it's as a result of this experience that I can say with a true depth of conviction that I regard the State Islamic University system, UIII, of which the UIIU today is an international representative. I regard this as the finest state-supported system of Islamic higher education in the world, the finest in the world. So I thank you for this invitation, and I extend my warm congratulations to Pak Komar, Pak Haidar, Pak Jamhari, and all the faculty and staff of the UIIU at this first year and momentous year of the opening of the university. Now, I've been asked today to address a question dear to my heart, and as Pak Vermante said, also central to a book that I'm currently completing, which has to do with the question of why the study of Islam in Indonesia is important. There are many such ways this question could be addressed. However, as the subtitle to my paper makes clear, I want to adopt two angles on the question. First, I want to examine how and why the study of Islam in Indonesia is important for this multidisciplinary academic field that we know as Islamic studies. And second, and no less important, I want to examine why the study of Islam in Indonesia is important for a very different field, comparative democratic theory. Over the 40 years now, and it has been that long, that I have visited and worked and written on Indonesia, I've long been convinced that neither of these two issues have been given sufficient attention in academic studies and in the various media-based and journalistic reports that we are familiar with on Indonesia. Notwithstanding its importance for our understanding of the Muslim world and comparative democratic transitions, in other words, Islam in Indonesia remains an underappreciated topic. So let me begin my observations with some general thoughts on just why the study of Islam in Indonesia has not been given the attention it deserves. For those of us who have long worked on the history of Islam and Islamic society in Indonesia, we know that there's been a tendency to attribute this neglect of Indonesia to either of two sets of influences. The first set centers on three facts. First, as we all know, Indonesia is located in Southeast Asia, far from what is typically regarded as Islam's classical heartland. Second, the great majority of Muslims here do not speak Arabic or Persian, not least of all as their first language. And third, most of the archipelago was drawn into Islam during the second rather than the first wave of Islamic civilizational expansion, which is to say Islam came to Indonesia, roughly speaking, in the period from the 13th to the 18th century. In so citing facts like these, many academic specialists of Islam, both in Indonesia and in other Muslim majority countries, or both in the West and other Muslim majority countries, many specialists of Islam have concluded that Indonesia is not part of the Islamic heartland and thus not integral what one needs to know to understand Islam. Now, compounding this devaluation of Indonesia's importance is what is sometimes called the sedimentary, lapis-lapisan, the sedimentary characterization of Islam in Indonesian civilization. By this, I refer to the deeply mistaken claim, and I think it is mistaken, that Islam is a relatively superficial layer in Indonesian civilization, a layer that lies atop a supposedly deeper and more culturally determinate Hindu, Buddhist, or even more inaccurate, animist subsoil. Now, the American anthropologist Clifford Geertz is often blamed for the simplistically sedimentary view of Indonesian Muslims, one that sees, again, Islam as Indonesia as not very deeply Islamic. Now, although I always considered myself a personal friend, much as Junior, but a friend of Clifford Geertz, there is no question that this characterization is wrong, and it has damaged Indonesia's place in comparative Islamic studies. My point in beginning with these background observations is to underscore what I believe has been a major shift in Islamic studies, international Islamic studies in recent years. It's a shift away from the notion that the Middle East is somehow a more authentic or legitimate site for the study of Islam. In place of this view, we are witness today to an important new trend in Islamic studies, one that's growing, I think, in ascendance, namely the recognition that the most striking feature of Islamic civilization is not its supposed origins in the Arab Middle East, which is not to deny that fact's importance, but the more central fact that from its 2nd century onward, Islam became the most globalized of world religions, spreading across a huge and multi-ethnic swath of Eurasia, one that was, one must emphasize, much larger than its Christian counterpart in Europe and the Middle East. Inasmuch as Islamic studies in recent years has come to emphasize Islam's remarkable feature of civilizational globalization, a shift has also occurred in the study of Islam. The shift is away from a Middle Eastern, or what we might say, and again, I say this neutrally, an Arabist emphasis to an exploration of the ways in which the universal dimensions of Islamic knowledge, ethics, and practice have everywhere evolved in subtle interplay with local, social, and cultural realities. Universalization and localization is the new theme, and one that, again, I think is a much better optic into an exploration of the distinctiveness and importance of Islam in Indonesia. One insight that is followed from this interactionist rather than essentialist or Arabist approach to the study of Islam has been to recognize that Islam's rooting and flourishing in a particular context everywhere involves a distinctive process of ethical hermeneutics and prioritization, or what I've elsewhere described using the Indonesian term as maslahatization. By this, I mean that in coming to terms with Islam's universal message, but in a local context, Muslims have had to engage in a subtle hermeneutic exercise whereby they explore the universal meanings, or what we might say, the maqasid of Islam, so as to understand just how that universal message can be made central and relevant to what really matters in a local setting. An interesting process of prioritization. Muslim scholars themselves, including the fuqaha, have developed a rich and varied assortment of discourses to understand just this interplay of the universal with the local. And in this, they differ profoundly. They're much more sophisticated than their Christian counterparts, for whom the question of localization and universalization has only become an issue in very recent years. The concepts of adat and urf were used early on to engage this reality of Islamic civilization's unity within diversity. Similarly, in the field of jurisprudence, or fiqh, the fuqaha devised the concept of maqasid, or the higher aims of Sharia and Islam, both to facilitate such localization, even while keeping the process of localization within the bounds of universal Islamic norms. A very, very interesting, remarkable process, characteristic, again, of Islamic civilization, and one with very little counterpart in the Christian West. The process I am describing here of understanding and prioritizing Islam's universal message in local settings has, of course, taken place all across the Muslim world, but the process shows several distinctive features here in Indonesia, and that's what really my remarks are going to focus on this morning. As Jajat Burhanuddin, Pa Azumardi Azra, and other scholars have demonstrated, during its first centuries, Islamic norms, Islamic normativity in Southeast Asia had a variety of forms, but it was above all a mystic-based, a tasawwuf-based, and adab-based, tasawwuf and adab-based, rather than exclusively or predominantly fiqhi or jurisprudential reality. In his 2016 book, the late South Asian scholar, become an American citizen, Shahab Ahmed, has shown that Indonesia was not unique in this regard. Ahmad's book shows brilliantly that in the area that he refers to as the Balkans to Bengal region, Islam, as he puts it, as a historical and human reality, was not grounded on or even prioritized around fiqh or jurisprudence alone, but involved a subtle cross-fertilization of Quranic epistemologies with varied cultural media, artistic performances, literary traditions, and discursive heritages. Now, in the case of Indonesia, we know that there were several historical facts that made this interplay of multiple epistemologies, multiple ways of knowing Islam, important for understanding the remarkable intellectual dynamism of Indonesian Islamic learning today. And that's my first point. My first real point is that this historical background, this distinctive way in which the Islam's universal message in Islam was localized in Indonesia, rather remarkably provided Indonesian Islamic learning and education in particular with a dynamism that really stands apart from most, not all, but most of the Muslim majority world. In the case of Indonesia, we know that there were several historical facts that made this interplay of epistemologies and hermeneutics distinctive. As Azumar de Azra, Ronald Ricci, and others have shown, trans-regional networks of literate Islamic scholars were put in place across the archipelago from the first century of the region's Islamization. So there was an Islamic tradition built solidly, an infrastructure of Islamic tradition built across the region from the 13th and 14th century on. However, and this is the important point, the mix of registers and epistemologies was slightly different from that in much of the Muslim Middle East from the 9th century on. In the latter region, madrasas emerged, as we all know, and then that institution spread across the entire Middle East and then into Central Asia from the 9th century on and became a major influence on the standardization of the Islamic sciences. Here in Indonesia, a comparable emergence of the Indonesian variation on the madrasa, which, as we all know, is known in Indonesia as a pondok or pondok pesantren, such an institution became a dominant presence only in the late 18th and 19th century, almost 6 centuries after the coming of Islam to the region. In other words, Muslims in Indonesia were becoming Islam and developing Islamic educational traditions and traditions of learning, but doing so in a way that had a somewhat different mix of institutions and practices than that of the more madrasa-dominated Islam of the Middle East. During its first centuries then, Islamic civilization here in Nusantara placed relatively less emphasis on the systematic study of fiqh. There was fiqh, but the systematic study of fiqh was less emphasized, and by contrast, there was a correspondingly stronger emphasis on tasawwuf and Islamic mysticism, as well as the arts, court-sponsored ritual performances, and what I will call here today, but I don't have time to discuss, something that I think is most remarkable feature of Islamic civilization in Indonesia, and that's what we might call sopan santun civility. There's something just uniquely Indonesian and deeply, deeply Islamic, Indonesian sopan santun. As we all know, eventually the balance of knowledge and values at the heart of this process of ethical knowledge making here in Indonesia changed. As I said earlier, in the late 19th century, a growing interaction with centers of pilgrimage and learning in the Middle East brought about a heightened engagement by Indonesian Muslim scholars with Middle Eastern and South Asian madrasas. And through these institutions, Indonesian Muslim scholars developed a deeper knowledge and emphasis on fiqh. From the middle decades of the 19th century onward, the Indonesian and Muslim Malaysian equivalent of the Middle Eastern madrasa, again, the pondok pesantren, became a much more prominent feature on the social and ethical landscape. Indonesians were Muslims before them, but the mix of jurisprudence, tasawwuf, adab, and sopan santun was somewhat different. Just as with the classical madrasas in the Muslim Middle East from the 9th century on, the study of the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet, and fiqh jurisprudence lay at the heart of the pesantren curriculum, and the rise of the pesantren again in the 19th century brought with it a new degree of fiqh-mindedness in the Indonesian Muslim community. But this process was not a simple one. Here's where the story of Indonesian Islam, education, and learning becomes, again, so remarkable and distinctive. What do I mean? Even as Indonesia in the 19th century developed the institutions for a madrasa-centered and fiqh-focused practice of Islam by way of the proliferation of pondok pesantren, the way in which Indonesian Muslims did so again reflected a distinctive balance of influences and understandings related again to an effort to come to terms with the maslahah, public good. What do I mean? The reason this was so was that no sooner had the new pondok pesantren based and supported tradition of fiqh normativity emerged and became a point of orientation for pesantren educated Muslims than for other observant Muslims, the hope for a more authentic profession of faith cross-fertilized. It cross-fertilized with other aspirational and other educational priorities. Here's where Indonesia's Islamic traditions become so interesting and so dynamic. What I'm referring to here is, of course, in the first instance, the tradition of Islamic renewal or tajdid, known in Indonesian Islam today as modernism. Faced with the threat of European colonialism, modernists in Indonesia, particularly in groups like the Muhammadiyah, concluded that the most effective epistemological and educational instrument for the welfare of the Muslim community was not just a fiqh-centered pesantren curriculum, though this was important, but what they called the Islamic day school, the Sekolah Islam, with its familiar but new mix of general education and Islamic studies. The educational history, now, when I talk about this, many of my Indonesian friends sort of say, well, so what? This was important? This is important? It is remarkable, and it is uniquely Indonesia. The educational history of Islamic schooling here in Indonesia is so familiar to Indonesian Muslim scholars, that its intellectual boldness, and it was that, and transformative impact compared to education in many other Muslim majority societies are often overlooked, even by Indonesian Muslims themselves. The Sekolah Islam variety of Islamic education, promoted first by Muslim modernists, but very soon adopted by all Indonesian Muslims, including quote unquote traditionalists in groups such as Nahdlatul Ulama. This new curriculum was not just a matter of blackboards, class levels, girls' education, and a curriculum that included science, mathematics, and history. This new approach to Islamic education emphasized that a proper understanding of Islam and Sharia required believers to intellectualize and contextualize Islamic ethical reasoning through a study of the Quran and Sunnah, now in interaction with the sciences of the world. In this manner, Muslim educational reformists here in Indonesia pioneered an epistemology similar to that which had flourished in the Muslim Middle East and South Asia from the 8th to 15th century, when Islamic learning and science were, without question, the most advanced in the world, precisely because of this imbrication of the sciences of revelation with the sciences of the world. In reviving this dual commitment to the sciences of revelation and the sciences of the world, Indonesian Muslim educators laid the foundation for Indonesian Islamic education to eventually become, as it has become, among the finest and most forward-looking in the world. In other words, there was this critical juncture in the late 19th and early 20th century, which worked out a new formula for understanding Quranic imperatives in a way, again, that brought them in dialogue with the sciences of the world, as the Quran itself enjoins. No less important, the forward-looking and capacious, that's a term from Shahab Ahmad's book, this capacious Islamic education in Indonesia did not diminish as the country made the turn from the mid-20th century to the turn of the a turn of the millennium, that is the 2000s. Compared to other Muslim majority countries, the most remarkable changes in Islamic learning over the past 4 decades have been those taking place in Islamic education and in the UIII system in particular. As we all know, Indonesia has 2 primary Islamic higher educational networks, the UIII, and second, and no less important, a privately operated but deeply important network of 160 colleges and universities run by the Muhammadiyah. What a combination. What a remarkable combination. From the early 1990s onward, both of these Islamic higher educational systems restructured their department facilities to incorporate disciplines seen by some people as separate from conventional Islamic education. That is, they incorporated economics, law, history, and social sciences as domains of knowledge, sciences of the world compatible with the Islamic sciences. At the cusp of the Reformasi era, Islamic universities went further and implemented an array of even bolder measures. Islamic universities led the way in developing new curricular materials on such general matters of general maslahah importance as citizenship, gender relations, and civic tolerance, issues of importance to the entire newly democratized nation. More boldly yet, these universities also opened their courses on Islamic jurisprudence, Quranic tafsir, and other Islamic societies to relatively new methodologies, including those often mischaracterized, not least of all by some Western observers, as secular or Western. They're not Western, they're human. Notable among the disciplines now welcome into the reformed approach, expanded, capacious approach to Islamic education, with disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, and comparative legal studies. These and other reforms to Islamic education are the most striking, are the most remarkable taking place anywhere in the modern Islamic world. I'm not diminishing Islamic education in 2 countries that I know well and I deeply respect, Iran and Turkey, but Indonesia is by all measures the most remarkable. These reforms represent, again, I must emphasize, not a secularization of Islamic education, but a return to the profoundly Quranic recognition that the sciences of religion are and must be enriched and deepened by being put into dialogue with the sciences of the world. There is a Quranic message, one that was deeply important and attended to such Western Christian scholars as John Locke. Remember, John Locke spoke Arabic and he learned much from Islamic philosophers and jurists. The impact of Indonesian Islam's broadened educational horizons has for the past century been complemented by another Indonesian development, the creation of new forms of associational life. What do I mean? Here too, Indonesia stands above and beyond virtually the entire Muslim world. I've said it before, but I'll say it again, namely that from a comparative Islamic perspective, Indonesia has the most associationalized variety of Muslim social welfare organizations in the world. All of them are dedicated to a modern and revitalized understanding of the maslahah public good, so as to apply Islamic knowledge and learning to the task of bettering the world. To take but one example, today the reformist Muhammadiyah has, as all of you know, some 35 million members. The Nahdlatul Ulama has 70 to 90 million. NU plays a leading role in the management of the country's 50,000 plus Islamic boarding schools. When I tell this to my Muslim friends in Egypt, Turkey, or other countries, they're astonished. You have an independent Islamic educational sector that's run by private Muslim associations? Yes, that's Indonesia. That's the remarkable feat of Indonesia. Similarly, the Muhammadiyah manages 12,000 Islamic day schools, 167 institutions of higher learning, perhaps more at more recent count, 421 orphanages, 345 polyclinics and hospitals, and so on. Here in practice is demonstrable evidence of a distinctly and maslahized understanding of Islamic ethics and public good priorities, one that is, again, without precedent in the rest of the Muslim majority world. Now, there was another byproduct of Muslim Indonesia's revisiting and reprioritization of Islamic learning for a maslahah public good. And this is another feature that speaks to the remarkable distinctiveness and achievement of Indonesian Islam. It was the conviction, I'm referring to the conviction among most, if not all Indonesian Muslims, that Muslim ideals of the public good are deeply consonant with the ideals and spirit of Indonesia's multi-ethnic and multi-religious model of nationhood and citizenship. What an amazing accomplishment. What an amazing accomplishment. What a powerful and deep understanding of Islamic ethics and the public good. We all know that this conclusion on the compatibility of Pancasila nationhood with Islam was not uncontested. There were, and there are still today, those who are convinced that the only form of nationhood properly consistent with Islam is that which is sometimes, I think, somewhat inappropriately referred to as a Negara Islam, or an Islamic state. This notwithstanding the fact that, as Sami Zubaida and many other scholars have said, the concept of the Islamic state in this particular form shows the more striking influence, not of Islamic traditions, but of modern Western concepts of law and nationality. Talal Asad has said the same. Indeed, as we know, in the 1950s and early 1960s, struggles over nationhood, citizenship, and Islamic law were at times so fierce that Indonesia's national unity seemed in question. But Muslim culture and society again and again re-equilibrated. And the Muslim community today has become the standard bearer of Indonesia's Pancasila nationalism. Without this Muslim gift to the nation, Indonesian nationhood and Indonesian democracy would not be possible. It's important to emphasize, and again, I'm directing my remarks here as much to Western analysts who misunderstand this remarkable Indonesian achievement. It's important to emphasize that Muslim community's commitment to multi-religious nationalism and civic pluralist Pancasila democracy were not the result of coercive top-down state engineering, least of all that conducted by secular nationalists. That's wrong. The commitment was first and foremost product of cultural shifts, epistemological shifts long underway in Indonesian Muslim society itself, related to a process of rethinking epistemological methods and maslahah priorities, a process of rethinking a new understanding of Islamic education that, as I have said, had been put in place from the early years of the 20th century. This same history also helps to explain why Indonesian Muslim scholars rallied to the idea of a multi-religious nation state. They did not do so, as some of my Western friends sometimes say, because Indonesians had been drawn to Western Enlightenment ideals. Where are these Western Enlightenment ideals? What did Westerners do with Western ideals? Maafkan saja. And I, of course, I don't mean to sound too critical of the West, but in the West, many of these same Enlightenment ideals were used to justify imperial conquests of huge expanses of the global South. This was not the case. This was not what motivated Indonesian Muslims in their rallying to the ideals of a multi-ethnic and multi-religious Pancasila state. What moved them to this commitment was not Western Enlightenment ideals, but a recognition that this variety of state was one that was most deeply compatible with Quranic ideas and Islamic ideals generally. A second and related, now let me turn to the question of is Indonesia's relevance for democratic theory, if it's okay that I continue. Pak Vermante, do I have sufficient time?
Yes, sure. It's
Okay.
too interesting to stop.
Okay, well, that's very kind of you. Itu yang namanya sopan santun Indonesia, saya kira kan. A second and related reason it is important to study Islam in Indonesia has to do with the exercise implications, as I said, for the comparative study of democracy. Certainly, like all modern democracies, including my own United States, lest that's not be clear, Indonesia in modern times has, of course, experienced repeated challenges to its efforts to make democracy work. Democracy is not a panacea. It doesn't resolve all problems automatically. Again, we can look at the legacy of African Americans in the United States. We can look at that long history. We can also look at the populist politics conducted in the United States under our last President Trump. And we recognize that democracy doesn't take care of all problems. It's merely an instrument that can be used, one hopes, for the improvement of society. In the early project, in the early republic, there were regional rebellions and movements of secessionism in Indonesia, but the project of Indonesia survived. In the early years of the post-Suharto Reformasi era, the national dream was again blighted or damaged by outbreaks of ethnic and communal violence, especially in eastern Indonesia. But after a few years of conflict, Indonesia stabilized. Once again, the dream of Indonesia and the Muslim dream of Indonesia surged forward and exercised the stabilizing influence. And the country has remained intact and as strong as ever in its history. That is an achievement, a remarkable achievement. The conclusion for comparative democratic theory, this example illustrates, is not only that Indonesia has demonstrated that democracy, multicultural citizenship, and Islam are compatible, but something more specific. These events have demonstrated that Muslim scholars, educators, and political leaders are themselves critical to the success of such democratic and civic endeavors. Without their contribution, without their collaboration, the ideals and realization of the project of Indonesia and Indonesian democracy would not be possible. Now, what exactly do I mean here? What is so striking about Indonesia is that the cultural ground for the return to democracy after May 1998 was laid not by Western secularist Democrats, as was the case in some Arab majority societies at the beginning of the Arab Spring, but was instead laid by an alliance of democracy-minded Muslims and, yes, Indonesians of other faiths. The return to democracy was in turn made possible by cultural shifts in Muslim public opinion, shifts that have been measured and studied by scholars like Shaiful Mujani with his survey instruments, and shifts that are seen in the studies that confirm that most of the public has come to regard democracy and Pancasila citizenship as thoroughly compatible with Islam. Among the 83% of the population that is Muslim, it was leaders and educators in mainstream organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, along with, once again, as I said earlier, the democracy-minded educators in the state Islamic university system and the Muhammadiyah network, who led the way in the promotion of this shift, demonstrating again the compatibility and indeed the compatibility of national citizenship and democracy with Islamic ideals and the necessary mutuality of both. In the case of the Muslim community, Muslim educators and mainstream leaders in organizations and Muhammad did even more than this, that is, convinced the Muslim public that Pancasila democracy was compatible with Islam. After the dawn of the Reformasi era, they led the way in reform-minded curricular materials on Islam and democracy, civic education, and the adaptation of Islamic law and ethics to the plural realities of modern Indonesia. Specialists of Islamic education and democratic reform across the Muslim world have long emphasized this essential role played by teacher training and curricular reform in Islamic education if the effort to promote democracy and pluralist citizenship is to succeed. And I say here tonight, no Muslim majority country has succeeded better at a more ambitious educational initiative and cultural shift of this sort than has Indonesia. There was an important comparative feature to these culture-making initiatives, being vital to the success of any democratic transition. These efforts demonstrated that the central current in the Muslim wing of the democracy movement that took shape in the 1990s had put in place a social linkage regarded by theorists of democratization like Guillermo O'Donnell and Philip Schmitter as vital for a successful transition from authoritarian rule. O'Donnell and Schmitter emphasized the key to successful democratic traditions is what they describe as a coalitional structure linking exemplary individuals, knowledgeable of and committed to democratic reform, to mass organizations in society. You have to have both. You have to have intellectuals like Noholish Majid and others, Amin Rais, who shaped the ideas, but you have to be able to link those ideas to mass movements that seek to implement them and make them a living reality in society as a whole. Why do I emphasize the Indonesian achievement in this regard? With a few rare exceptions, Middle Eastern countries swept into the Arab Spring proved far less capable of establishing a linkage between exemplary individuals and intellectuals and broad social movements like those that we saw here in Indonesia. As a result of this failure in the Arab Spring, the democratic transitions attempted in Arab majority societies all failed, with the notable but really only partial exception of course, Tunisia. As Mohammed Qasim Zaman, a friend of mine, has demonstrated a similar inability to draw Muslim educators, madrasa educators, into the task of building democracy and to promoting an inclusive national citizenship has handicapped Pakistani Muslim Democrats since the 1950s. They haven't been able to do what their Indonesian educational counterparts have been. Pakistan has long had a very sophisticated and democratic-minded Muslim intelligentsia. There's no shortage of very smart people in Pakistan, we know. However, as Qasim Zaman has shown again and again, these reform-minded Muslim Democrats have been unable to establish enduring reformist alliances with Muslim educators with ties to Pakistan's madrasas and Muslim organizations. And this again is what the Indonesian Muslim intelligentsia and educators were able to do. There was another way, finally, in which Indonesia's return to democracy provides evidence of a remarkable and important synergy, and one that is often overlooked in discussions of Indonesia internationally. It has to do with the Indonesian military. The military? Yes, the military. The military's role in the democratic transition owed much to the fact that over the course of the late New Order period, the Indonesian armed forces had come to a new understanding of Islam and nationalism. They did so not as a result of just their own thoughts, but as a result of 2 generations of careful scholarship and dialogue and policy contributions carried out by Muslim educators and intellectuals reaching out to the Indonesian armed forces. Now, to appreciate just how significant, how remarkable this Indonesian development, it requires a quick international comparison. As Marcus Mitzner has noted, in most structural respects, the Indonesian military in 1998 resembled the Egyptian military in 2010, as Egypt began its transition to the Arab Spring. Both militaries, for example, have played a central and proud role in maintaining their country's national independence. Both are extensively involved in social and economic, as well as defense affairs. And in the early years of their respective democratic transitions, or attempted democratic transitions in the case of Egypt, both militaries held back and allowed the democratic opening to proceed. However, in the end, the policies of the 2 military establishments could not have been more different. In response to the authoritarian missteps, and that's what they were, of the government of President Morsi in Egypt, the military in Egypt intervened and expelled the Morsi government from power, thereby bringing the democratic transition in Egypt to a halt, and at a cost of many human lives, as we all know. And now I'm not interested one way or another in taking sides in the Egyptian affairs here. My point is simply that the Indonesian Armed Forces Command acted entirely differently and with much greater wisdom. It lent its support to the electoral and legislative reforms at the heart of Reformasi, and in doing so, it contributed vitally to the success of Indonesia's democratic transition. Now, it's important to emphasize that the Indonesian Armed Forces leadership was able to act in this measured way precisely because, as Mitzner and others have demonstrated, that is the military's interactions with Muslim intellectuals and politicians had led them to realize that rather than Islam and nationalism being antithetical or contrary, the two here in Indonesia give ethical direction and political durability to both. That's a huge change. And that too owes much to the contributions of the Muslim community. As we all know, of course, this is my last section of my paper, not everything has been easy in Indonesia's return to democracy. Notwithstanding the distinctive legacies about which I've spoken this morning, in Reformasi Indonesia, the proponents of the new and inclusive public ethics, Islamic public ethics, have at times faced fierce resistance, most significantly from a diverse array of exclusivist Islamist militias. After the return to electoral democracy in 1998, 1999, Indonesia witnessed in particular the explosive growth of many of these locally based exclusivist Islamist vigilantes. In addition to their assaults on the country's small Ahmadi and Shi'i communities, these Islamist militias engaged in what I have called, my words are quite deliberate, what I have called a tactic of epistemological populism. Epistemological populism, what do I mean? By this term, I mean that the militias sought not merely to limit the rights of minorities, but also to discredit and destroy the sophisticated educational methodologies that the mainline Muslim community, working with the Ministry of Religious Affairs, had painstakingly put in place over the better part of 70 years. They had put in place an infrastructure for the study of Islam in a manner that, again, I emphasize, brings the Islamic sciences into dialogue with the sciences of the world. There's Indonesia's remarkable achievement. And that is what the exclusivist Islamist militias also sought to destroy. In the face of developments like these, one of the most distinguished Western analysts of Indonesian Islam, my friend Martin van Branissen, has observed that since the early 2000s, Muslim Indonesia has taken or experienced a conservative turn. I'm a great admirer of Martin's scholarships, and I agree with some of the points that he makes. However, in this instance too, I think it's important to emphasize that we would do best to steer clear or to keep away from the familiar Western binary of liberal versus conservative when attempting to come to terms with what's going on with regards to Islam in Indonesia. In the term's literal sense, conservatism refers to a political and ethical tradition that seeks to preserve a tradition of knowledge and a way of life, because both are deemed still deeply relevant for the contemporary age. Measured by this definitional standard, the exclusivist Islamist militias who emerged in the early 2000s were not at all conservative. On the contrary, they were destructive of Indonesian Muslim traditions and values. Foremost among the militia's targets for destruction were two entities: Indonesia's remarkable Islamic higher educational system, about which I've talked today, and second, and no less significant, the second target were the traditions of sopan santun, civility, that for many Indonesians lie at the very heart of how Muslims here in Indonesia express an adab-based variety of Islamic ethics and sociability in everyday interaction. We know how much the militias regarded sopan santun, Indonesian sopan santun, as something which was not Islamic. As I understand it, it reflects the deepest and most powerful of Islamic values, and it's a living representation of all that is beautiful and accomplished in Indonesian Muslim society. Of course, however, and this is my final set of remarks, the story of the Muslim contribution to Indonesian democracy is not over. And in my opinion, the future still seems bright, notwithstanding certain conservative terms. And the UN Muhammadiyah and the UIII educational system maintain, for the most part, their steady course. By linking a maslahah-based emphasis on the public good to the ideals and practices of multi-religious citizenship, Indonesian Muslims continue to demonstrate the depth of their commitment to multi-religious nationalism. And in so doing, they make that Pancasila nationalism a living reality. They have also brought about an epistemological and educational revolution comparable in its scope to that which marked the golden age of Muslim science and learning 600 years ago. In emphasizing the achievement of Islamic society and ethics here in Indonesia, then, I take gentle exception to those in the foreign Indonesian studies community who argue that the strongest resources for pluralist citizenship and multicultural flourishing in Indonesia lie in legacies inherited from the distant pre-Islamic past. In an article entitled Religious Pluralism or Conformity in Southeast Asia's Cultural Legacy, an article published in Studia Islamica in 2015, my dear friend and a man from whom I've learned greatly, namely Anthony Reed, he startled me by expressing a variation on this point, that is, that the resources, the richest resources for Indonesian coexistence lay in the distant pre-Islamic past. He emphasized in particular that Asia in general and Indonesia in particular has long been a great laboratory of religious pluralism, and that precedent was put in place in the medieval and pre-Islamic period, not in modern times or under the auspices of Muslim scholars, intellectuals, and associations. I must, for all these reasons, politely dissent from Tony Reed's conclusion. In modern Indonesia, the greatest cultural supports for inclusivity and civic pluralism have been grounded not in the country's pre-modern past, but in the efforts of Muslim intellectuals and educators to build modern Islamic traditions of maslahah ethics and epistemological learning. The legacy of the Muslim community's intellectualization and maslahatization of education, public ethics, and governance remains a living and powerful force in Indonesian public life today. It is truly one of the unheralded achievements of Islam di Nusantara. And by continuing to build on this distinctive Indonesian legacy of maslahah ethics and epistemological openness, Indonesia holds the promise of fulfilling its promise of being a true and important rahmati alam, a blessing, not just to the Muslim world, but to all of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hefner, for your very, very stimulating and interesting presentation. I believe the participants enjoyed the presentation as much as I do. And my notes probably getting longer than your papers because a lot of questions and insight that would provoke, I think, ideas as well as probably further thinking here at the UIIU as well as in among the public who are participating. Now we do have times for Q&A, and there are a lot of questions in the Q&A box. I might organize them into several questions. There are 7 currently, but I can group them together. First of all, I can group them into 3 set of questions. Number 1, from Khairun Niam, I can group the question from him and from Mr. Musa Maliki. That is concerning the issue on universality and particularity of Islam in Indonesia. Which one is, do you think, the dominant impression from the outsider? And then Musa Maliki asked, is there any authenticity of Islam in Indonesia? If yes, what is Islamic authenticity in Indonesia? Is it a pure Islam made by Indonesian scholars, or is it blended and malleable Muslim interpretations in Indonesia? I think we can start with those 2 questions, Professor Hepner. Screen is yours.
Well, these are both very, very good questions, very big questions, but I will keep my response short because I've already spoken at some length about universality and particularity, which is dominant. The process is itself intrinsic to Islam and Islamic civilization. Islam itself, the message of the Prophet, the vision and ethical aspiration of Quranic ideals are, of course, universal. Revelation is universal. It's understood as universal by Muslims themselves. So the universality in many regards has to be that which is dominant. But the process of coming to terms in what Shahab Ahmad has, to use his phrase, what he speaks of a historical and human community of Islam. That's we don't live as malaika, we don't live as prophets, we don't live as deities. We're not deities. So that the living reality, that is Islam as a historical and human community, as opposed to its universal message, a key feature of that historical and human community is that the universal message has to be understood, interpreted, and worked so as to be meaningful and effective in a particular time and place. So I would say it's not a question of which is dominant. It's a question of how the process of universalization and localization is played out in somewhat different ways in different societies. If we look, for example, just to end very quickly, many Westerners assume that Islam is a deeply patriarchal religion, and they'll look to things like the incidents of honor killings in some parts of the Middle East, although I would point out that honor killings were as common in Christian areas of Greece as they were in Muslim areas of Turkey. But anyway, some people associate a certain type of masculinism, if you will, with Islam. And it's clearly not Islam. It clearly has to do with the fact that the universal message of Islam was received in communities that had extended kin groups, just if I may speak like an anthropologist, kin groups that were organized patrilineally and therefore accorded greater authority and distinction to men and the transmission of rights and social identities through male kin relations. Many people in the West, and I think perhaps even some Muslims in the Middle East, mistakenly assume that these qualities of local culture, the particularities of local culture, are somehow Islam. They're not. This is just another example, however, of the way in which the universal message always interacts with local cultural traditions. And for someone who is committed, as I believe Muslims must be committed, if I may say so, to the universal and unchanging message of Islam, one has to be very careful not to confuse that which is uniquely local and distinctive to just one part of the world to the universal and unchanging message of Islam. So ethically speaking, which is dominant? The universal. Sociologically speaking, which is in practice may exercise greater influence. This depends upon the context. But just as with Christian ideals in the West, those ideals may be deformed through deployments in situations that really don't have to do with Christian ideals, but with power plays and identity politics.
Thank you, Professor Hefner, for the response. And there is another question. You also touch upon the question on the matter of science, teaching and so on. And there's a question from Wedra Prison from UIIN Bukit Tinggi. He's experimenting with his network in teaching modern science to students. And he said in the question that they wanted to teach science that is not separated from Islamic values. Now, this is the old debates about the Islamization of knowledge, Islamization of science, and so on. What do you think of this kind of teaching? Will it be detrimental to science and benefiting Islam, or vice versa? How would you perceive this?
I think that a proper Islamic attitude towards the sciences would insist on the Quranic ideal. It is a Quranic ideal that the knowledge of the world is itself another way of knowledge of God, of Allah. It's not an exclusive way. It, of course, does not preempt revealed knowledge. But the revelation, the message of the Quran itself makes very clear the coming to term with the realities of the natural world. Natural law is itself an expression and illustration of divine command and divine law. So I have no, I think that the idea that one would bring Islamic values to the study of science and that might make a difference in how one does the science, I have no difficulty with that at all. Where I have some questions is in how certain people, particularly here in the United States, the Islamic science, the movement for the Islamization of science, it actually began here in the United States among Egyptian and Palestinian expats who were active and very bright. I knew some of them many years ago, and I had great sympathy for what they were doing. But at times, I think they perhaps exaggerated the degree to which an Islamic attitude towards knowledge would result in, for example, physics or chemistry that was fundamentally different. No, it would, I think, an Islamic knowledge and a religious attitude generally will result in a different attitude. It's as with Islamic economics. Islamic economics doesn't change laws of supply and demand, but it may enjoin hotel keepers to say, no, you should not allow prostitution to take place in a hotel. That doesn't change the laws of economics, but it brings a different ethical values to the application of Islamic ethics. And there, I think, the attitude of saying we want to bring Islamic values to science and the practice of learning is a proper one.
Thank you, Professor Hefner. Certainly, this discussion generated a lot of questions in the Q&A. And there's this one question from anonymous attendee. He is or she is asking about the role of different madhab in in the resilience of a probably religious life in Indonesia. How would you see that? What is the role of this different madhab in the question is not specifically about Indonesia, or rather it's about Indonesia. What's the role of different madhab here?
Well, I think as the Prophet said, you know your affairs better than I. And I think on matters of jurisprudence and madhab, this is a matter for Muslims in Indonesia, as in all of the world, to determine on their own, and they'll reach different conclusions. But I think, if I may adopt the perspective of my friends at the State Islamic University system, I think one of the changes that's taken place in our understanding of madhab is rather than seeing the madhab as a kind of an instrument of conformity from which if you're this, you cannot deviate. One looks to the madhab traditions as offering a wealth, as bearing witness to the wealth of scholarship and the diversity of opinion that has been a key feature of Islamic legal traditions. We know there are limits to that. I'm not trying to idealize or romanticize, but as far as the madhab goes, if we compare jurisprudence in Islam with, for example, Christian canon law, which was formulated under the auspices of what eventually became known as the Roman Catholic Church, the differences are hugely enormous, which is to say, the founders of the madhab, and Shafi'i in particular, recognized at a certain point on certain critical matters, one has to tolerate diversity of opinion. This doesn't mean anything goes. It's not a free market of, everybody can just say everything they want, and there is in our times, and this is true in Christian tradition even more than it is in Islam, there are some people who think, well, nobody has to know anything. Anybody can say everything. Well, you might be able to do that. But I don't think that's necessarily a formula for wisdom. A better formula for wisdom is, I think, the one that we see demonstrated in the pages of Islamic journals in Indonesia, or here in the United States with scholars like Abdullahi Ahmad An-Naim, who recognize that the richness of the madhab is not a kind of prescription for conformity, but it bears witness to a richness and diversity from which Muslims still today can and should learn.
Thank you, Professor Hefner. There is this one question probably for the comparative democratic theory part of your presentation. A question from Farid Sainong. He was referring to the recent article by Bill Liddell and Syaiful Murjani in the Journal of Democracy, titled Jokowi Sidelines Democracy, on the perceived decline of Indonesian democracy, while the promotion of Indonesian Islam is on the peak at the time of Pak Jokowi. Would you think this is the different ways of how anthropologists and political scientists work?
Well, I have an appointment both in the Department of Anthropology and the Department of International Relations. So when I work at the Department of International Relations at Boston University, which is known as the Pardee School of Global Affairs, I'm with political scientists. So, and they hired me. So I don't consider myself exclusively an anthropologist. I'm speaking of madhab, I'm a madhabi pluralist on matters of the social sciences. Unfortunately, if this is a new article, I'm not familiar with this article. I read and very much enjoyed Syaiful Murjani, Bill Liddell's, and Thomas Popinski's book on Indonesian democracy. I think that was a remarkable work. And I think in particular, Syaiful Murjani's survey work is outstanding. So since I haven't read the article, I hesitate to comment on the judgment they passed on the Jokowi government. But perhaps I'll just say this: Indonesia has at various times faced an existential crisis. And the crisis is, not just if democracy is to advance, if the nation is to survive, there has to be some measure of agreement on the fundaments of what it means to be Indonesian and what Indonesian citizenship involves. And I'm not referring to the presidential elections. I don't really care about that. And there's a diversity of opinion, and we know that. That's not what I'm referring to. But we do know that there were people in groups like, if I will say so, Hizb ut-Tahrir and others, who fundamentally rejected and sought the idea of the legitimacy of the Indonesian nation state. And I think the severity of that challenge was quite real. And I think in those circumstances, certain measures were taken about which people can have different opinions, such as the banning of Hizb ut-Tahrir. They can have different opinions. But to speak generally and comparatively, I do not think there has been a massive democratic regression in Indonesia, number one, any more, and in fact, less so than in my own United States of America. And I'm a proud American. Let me make that clear. My son is in the armed forces. He's in the army. So I'm not, but I also recognize, precisely because I care about my own country, I also recognize that democracy is not a panacea, and American democracy is experiencing one of its most severe trials in its history. So there's something in the air globally. We see this in India too, a great democracy, which is treating its Muslim minority awfully. So there's a crisis of citizenship there. There's a crisis of citizenship with the rise, as we see with the elections in France. There's something, a kind of populist imaginary in the air that's threatening democracy everywhere. And this leads to, I think, on the part of many people in Indonesia, not just the Jokowi supporters, but many people in Indonesia, leads them to believe there has to be an effort to preserve some measure of common cultural consensus on what Indonesia is, what it means to be Indonesian. So I'm not commenting on Pat Scheifel and Pat Little's article, and as you heard me say, their book with Thomas Babinski, there was nothing I disagreed with. I thought it was a brilliant book. But I think people sometimes exaggerate the degree to which there's a kind of crisis of democracy continuing in Indonesia, and somehow this goes back to Pak Jokowi. I think what's happening in Indonesia is a lesser version, a less drastic version of what we see in the United States. People are challenging the very foundations of the nation and citizenship, and this is a very, very serious thing. I, at this moment, feel that if we use the term democratic regression, the regression here in the United States is every bit as serious, and in some ways more worrying, because it enjoys the support of such a large percentage of the population. That regression then is greater than in Indonesia.
Right, thank you, Professor Hefner. Related to your comments on that, there's this question from Siti Rahmasari. She raised this, I think, interesting ideas. Previous studies indicate that a necessary condition for the persistence of democracy is the existence of convergent systems of values. How would you see this convergence of value between religion and democratic attitudes or democratic institutions? She asked specifically in Boston, but I think she meant in Indonesia or in Boston.
Well, I'm not sure about Boston. Well, I'm not sure about the United States, as I just said, but I agree with her question that there does need to be a convergence of religious and democratic values. But I think the point of my paper was to suggest that what's remarkable about Indonesia, certainly by comparison with many of the societies drawn into the Arab Spring, what's remarkable about Indonesia is that there has been such a convergence. It's not perfect. It cannot be perfect. We live in a plural and complex age, but the degree to which Indonesians have, if you will, come to see Islamic values as consistent with democratic values and Pancasila values is, I think, striking. Now, I know, of course, people will say, but wait a minute, we understand the Pancasila in widely different ways. That's true. And that's a part of the democratic process. It's not inimical to the democratic process. It's part of the democratic process whereby Indonesians themselves, in an open way rather than a closed way that says, inilah yang namanya Pancasila. Rather than that, there's an open discussion and debate. And that's a healthy, very healthy part of Indonesian democracy and public culture today.
Thank you, Professor Hefner. I hope you don't mind, because there are a lot of questions here, and I think are relevant to your presentation and to our knowledge here. You also touch upon about the role of civil society in spreading and providing maslahah, public goods, and you specifically mentioned about school systems provided by Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. And there is this question from Muhammad Irfan Hasanuddin that referring to the phenomenon of the rising numbers of the so-called Sekolah Islam, Islamic schools, initiated certainly by middle class in Indonesia. Some of these schools are expensive. You can find them in big cities and so on. And to some extent, according to Muhammad Irfan Hasanuddin, they are challenging the existence of madrasah and pesantren, where the Sekolah Islam or Islamic schools emphasize more on the ideology that is essentializing and centralizing Islam that can be counterproductive to the idea of the Indonesian democracies. So how do you see this contestation between the context of Islamic education provided by the civil society organizations like Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama through madrasah and pesantren, and with these Islamic schools set up by the new middle class, especially in the big cities in Indonesia?
Well, this is a question on which Pak Jamhari Makhruf has had has done much research, much brilliant research. And I almost hesitate to say anything, Pak Jam, because you're in the audience here, and I think you know better than I about this. But should I proceed, Pak Jam? Bolehkah?
Please, Pak. Please, Pak.
I've visited many Sekolah Islam Terpadu. I think the important thing to emphasize right from the start is that what are called Sekolah Islam or Sekolah Islam Terpadu actually, first of all, they reflect a great variety of normative perspectives. Perhaps many of them lean in a sort of, if in terms of party affiliation, in a Partai Keadilan Sejahtera direction. But the Partai Keadilan Sejahtera itself is an evolving institution. And indeed, in recent years, it's evolving, I think, in a very interesting way that testifies to the fact that as it seeks to position itself more effectively in Indonesian society, and as its membership gets older, it has come to understand Indonesia and Islam in somewhat subtler ways. And I think the same. I don't think this is going to happen across the board. Sekolah Islam Terpadu and Sekolah Islam in general come in a variety of forms. But my impression, and again, I mean it when I said I wasn't just being modest when I said that Pak Jamhari would know better than I, because he's been out he and his staff have done research on this school movement more recently than I have. But what visits I have made, and what I've read indicates that this is an evolving institution. And I actually think that in an interesting way, success, that is, its continuing appeal, will draw it in some ways more intimately into the complex realities of Indonesia. Now, that said, I know I have visited schools in which Sekolah Islam of a certain variety, in which there is very explicit education against the Pancasila and against democracy. But my sense in general, but Pak Jam can speak more confidently, is that this is an evolving institution. We're only 20 years, really 22 years into Reformasi and this enormous cultural change. We're only 22 years into the formation of a new Indonesian Muslim middle class under the circumstances of democracy. So there's a grand experiment that's been going on for 22 years. There's lots of ideas being put forward, but my impression is that this evolution will continue, and I remain confident that the center, the Islamic Educational Center, will remain true to a more properly Indonesian rather than an exclusivist understanding of citizenship.
Thank you, Prof. Hefner. Prof. Jamhari, would you like to jump in on this question?
No, thank you. I think we have a great start here, Prof. Hefner. So Okay, continue to the other question.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Jam. Prof. Hefner, there's a follow-up question on your assessment about Islamic studies in Indonesia. Why is it important and so on? Would you update us on the Islamic studies in the West, how they are doing now, and then are they really moving into the region like Indonesia and Southeast Asia instead of concentrating on the Middle East? We know that you touched this on your presentation, but in general, the generation of scholars in Islamic studies in the West, do they kind of have a new generation of Islamic studies scholars and so on that would appreciate what you are thinking about Islam in Indonesia in particular, and probably a region outside the Middle East?
I think the general trend in the West, first of all, there are a couple of background facts to start with. Islamic studies in the West today, as opposed to more than 30 years ago when I entered higher education after getting my PhD, Islamic studies in the West today has a far greater representation of Muslims from around the world. Now, most of them are still disproportionately from South Asia, the Arab Middle East, Iran. But increasingly, there are Southeast Asian voices as well. And at the very least, we can say the point that I made at the beginning of my paper, that there's a shift away from a kind of tendency to say, no, the most authentic Islam is that which originated in Arab societies back in the 1st and 2nd centuries Islamic era. There's a shift away from that to recognizing that, this civilization is remarkable for its globalization. How did that happen? And in attempting to understand how that happened and how Islam as a historical and human reality, again, to use Shahab Ahmed's term, how this globalization occurred, with this question has come a kind of new emphasis and a new appreciation of the way in which the culture, not the values, not the revelation, not the wahyu, not the Quranic knowledge, but the culture and social expression of Islam has varied. So I would say in general, those two changes are huge. Namely, there's many more Muslims teaching about us in Islamic studies departments than was the case 30 years ago, many, many more. And secondly, there's a greater appreciation of the diversity of the Muslim world, although I would say it's still not sufficient. It's still not sufficient, but there's been great progress. And one of the drivers of that progress, I would add, has been Indonesia. Indonesia, it used to be easy for my Turkish and Iranian and Egyptian friends to say, Indonesia, it's not very important. And even among secular nationalist Egyptians, of which there were once many, they would sort of dismiss Indonesia as, what do we have to learn from them? But both the kind of nationalist and sort of secular-minded Muslim scholars, but more importantly, the religiously committed Islamic scholars, there's a new awareness that Indonesia, something very interesting is going on in Indonesia. Few people understand it fully, but the fact that, among other things, and I end here, the fact that the Arab Spring led to such bitter disappointment, and it did for me too. It broke my heart what happened in the aftermath. The war in Syria. Syria is a great and beautiful country, a great and learned country and here, see what happens. And then everywhere except Tunisia again. So that people look now and they say, but wait a minute, this country in Southeast Asia that we always knew it was big, but it's not just big. It's creating now a new class of Islamic universities, intellectuals, and its democracy. Well, some people say it's not very good, but it looks pretty impressive. And so I think again, we're just 22 years into Reformasi. This is still, in terms of the changing of world attitudes, relatively recent. I think the future looks bright for a deepened understanding of the social diversity, not the religious or revelation diversity, but the social diversity of the Muslim world, and most importantly, the remarkable achievements of Indonesian national and religious Islamic education and culture.
Thank you, Prof. Hefner. This is the last question, and I think this is a more general one. You know, overseas graduate Islamic scholars in Indonesia who are overseas graduate sometimes praise themselves to be seen as liberal and secular and so on. So they got challenged as well. Do you see this common in other countries, especially in the Muslim majority countries, who have this kind of graduates that try to be an open-minded and forward-looking scholars, but they are in the end kind of have to slow down, and because they have to adjust with the local setting, in different way. Local setting can also force you to lower your voice, or even becoming less and less reformist and in general.
Well, I wouldn't want to use the term secular, because my impression is that actually among Indonesians, but more generally among the great number of Muslim graduate students with whom I've worked or whom I've gotten to know, I don't think most of them are secular in the sense of being not committed to Islam. There's secular. Secular can mean, non-religious. It can also mean just recognizing that the sciences of the world have to be taken on their own terms, even if one studies them with a deep commitment to their being evidence of God's majesty. So number one, I do not have the impression today. I think maybe 40 years ago, when there was a sharper, if I can speak kind of crudely, there was a sharper divide between secular socialists and Marxists on one hand, and then people of Muslim faith. I think this experience of coming to the West, studying the West, and then going back could be one that created a certain estrangement from one's own culture and one's own religion. But my impression, I mean, I haven't done a study, and I suspect there are good sociological studies of Muslims returned to various homelands after studies in the West. But my sense is, while they don't look like Said Qutb, who after all studied in the West and did not become more secular, I think in fact most of them have often come away with a deeper or a deepened or unwavering commitment to and appreciation of Islam and Islamic values and truth. But they learn, just as all of us learn, to combine the sciences of the world with the sciences of the text, of the Nas, of the Quran, in new ways. And that, of course, is an attitude that's not antithetical to Islam. That is, as I understand Islam, that is a properly and a deeply Islamic value. And one that I think what's so interesting about Islam, I mean, I have over the last couple of years been reading Islamic philosophy and jurisprudence, and I just it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that I've come to appreciate that some of the best philosophical scholarship, falsafa scholarship, really was in a period from about the 7th and 8th and 9th century to the 19th and 20th century was by Muslims. A deep engagement with, not subservience to, for example, Greek philosophy, Unani philosophy, but a recognition that it's a tool that can be critically used, adjusted, and that this tradition, it has a remarkable, first of all, without it, Islamic modern Western philosophy and Western universities would not have been possible. So no, I don't think studying in the West leads to estrangement. And in fact, I think it can lead to, and I say this on the basis both of personal conviction, but also on the basis of just watching many Muslim friends, it can lead to a deepened and very sophisticated engagement with divine revelation.
Thank you, Professor Hefner, for your presentation and your response to all the tough questions from the audience. And I believe we learn a lot, and then it will provoke more thinking. And that's, I think, the essence and the objective of this kind of discussion. We should generate more questions than answer. I think that is the healthy academic environment that we want to stimulate here. Now, I'm going to use the last 3 minutes, if I may, to highlight some points that you raised in your presentation that I think is very important to be remembered. Number one, you highlighted the reason why Indonesia was in a way neglected by a foreign Islamic observer. This is the old reason why. Number one, the geographical context, that Indonesia is not part of the Islamic heartland. We are not part of the first wave of the spread of Islam in the beginning, and in particular, we are not Arabic-speaking country. But you highlighted that there's a shift towards this kind of previous attitude about Islam in Indonesia, that is now the Middle East is not seen as the only center of the Islamic civilization. And you highlighted the richness of Islamic norms in Southeast Asia that is probably having distinctive features that is a kind of a tasawwuf based and not fiqh based and so on and so forth, that would provide an alternative view about Islam, and it's as rich in Southeast Asia and in particular in Indonesia. Secondly, the intellectual dynamism. I think this is very important, that surrounded the Islamic learning and education in Indonesia. That we have a good mix of history and modern intellectual dynamism, the mix between tasawwuf, mysticism, and sopan santun civility. I think this is a very generic term that probably is true, but we don't know whether this is sustainable in the era of social media, that sometimes we lost the sopan santun civility in social media because we are being anonymous. Your identity is not revealed and so on and so forth, but I hope it will sustain. Thirdly, I think the shift also highlighted the fact that many observers overlook the long history of Islamic learning and teaching in Indonesia that actually helped to intellectualize and contextualize Islamic teaching in the local as well as modern context. Multidisciplinary nature of recent Islamic studies, especially on Islam in Indonesia, sociology, anthropology, political science, economics, and so on, that also help to elevate Indonesia in the radar of the global discourse of Islam, Islamic studies. Fourth, the role of civil society that cannot be found elsewhere, in Egypt and others, as you mentioned in your presentation. The civil society coexists with the government in providing maslahah, public goods, in education, in health, and so on, that intertwine with the intellectual dynamism. And fifth, nationalism and Islam and Pancasila. This triangular kind of relationship has been going on in Indonesia that helps also growing the sense of citizenship in Indonesia, that help a peaceful, quote unquote, peaceful relations between religion and the state in Indonesia, that is not top down, kind of imposing state ideology into the community. But you cited the public opinion survey that showed Pancasila is embraced by the community itself. So it's a kind of a blended efforts by the civil society and community as well as the government in creating a kind of a moderate Indonesia with the majority Muslim population. You also highlighted, and I think this is important, you are quoting O'Donnell and Smither works, on democracy, transitioning to democracy that is coalitional structure, linking individuals, scholars like Nurholis Majid, and we hope that IIIU will be part of that kind of force, you know, in the society, the Islamic scholars and scholars at the university that would link to the mass movement. So it creates a healthy discourse on Islam, on democracy, on Pancasila in Indonesia. Lastly, there's one challenge that you mentioned, and it is very interesting, I think, to note epistemological populism that we need to tackle, because it discredits the long work of education strategy of among these Muslim educators in Indonesia that helped the foundation of the Indonesian electoral democracy. I think that's some highlights. Of course, I would not be able to capture all the richness of your presentation and all the discussions. I would like to thank everybody for participating and for attending this webinar. We will see you again in our next webinar. And now I hand over the screen, I don't know, to the rector or to Pak Fahrul, Pak Rector, if you would like to give some kind of a closing remarks. The screen is yours, Pak Rector, Prof. Komarudin. Or we have Vice Rector Pak Jamhari or Pak Bahrul, if you want to say something to thank Prof. Hefner. Pak Jamhari.
Okay, thank you, Pak Philip. On behalf of the university, I would like to thank you to Professor Robert Hefner. I think a friend of us for a long time, and I think we always enjoy reading your works and also your presentation. And please forgive us if we feel very great and happy with your presentation, because you pull our leg about Indonesian Islam. And of course that we hope that it is truly from the research, not from sopan santun of political scientists from America to say about Indonesia. So once again, Pak Bob, thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak, and we hope that we can continue cooperation and do research together in the next future. Thanks, Pak. And also thank you to Pak Philip. Back to you, to Fahrul.
Thank you, Prof. Jamhari. Thank you, Mr. Phillips Bermonte, for having chaired this webinar session, and Prof. Jamhari for his closing remarks. Again, our gratitude should go to Professor Robert Hefner for his brilliant and passionate lecture. We also appreciate all participants for joining us. See you in the next webinar. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Pak Bob, thank you very much.
Terima kasih, Pak Bob.
Terima kasih. Ya, terima kasih. Selamat pagi. Terima kasih.
Sebelum Pak Bob leave,
Luar biasa.
You want to take a group picture?
Yeah, we should take a group picture before Pak Bob leaves.
Okay, all right, group picture.
I would like to invite all panelists to come on cam. By the count of 3, I think the Zoom admin will capture.
So Pak Bob, you are the only person, wearing batik.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Pak Bob.
Thank you,
Thank you, Pak Bob.
Selamat pagi, Pak Philip.
Terima kasih
banyak. Terima kasih.